This is the 2023 report of the 2022 statistics to the Wisconsin Annual Conference. Hello, my name is Don Cramer. I am a member of Milwaukee Central United Methodist Church. I am a volunteer statistician for the Wisconsin Annual Conference, and my email address is up on the screen if you have any questions or comments about this report. It can also be found on the website for Finance and Administration for the Wisconsin Annual Conference. My presentation has three goals today. I want to go over the annual data collection process. I want to do a year-to-year comparison of our data. And I also want to talk about the characteristics of the Wisconsin Annual Conference. Each year, our entire denomination collects data from local churches. Here in Wisconsin, we ask the churches to submit their data by the end of February. And then I check that information, I look for errors, I compile it, and then I submit our data to the General Council of Finance and Administration, the GCFA, by the end of April. That data is then used to look at trends. It's used to calculate apportionments, not only on the local church level, but also at the conference level. You can see here the data that was collected in 2021. This is all of the North Central jurisdiction of which Wisconsin is a part of. Our information is at the second to bottom row there. And again, this is from the end of 2021. Wisconsin is one of the smaller annual conferences in our jurisdiction. I want to remind you that all of the data on this page comes from local churches. It comes from compiling all that information that's entered from a local church level. So our Wisconsin data takes hundreds of people to submit that information. From your local churches, that includes, your secretaries, your treasurers, your trustee chairs, your pastor, your admin assistants. Someone at your church was submitting that data. It's not glorious work, but it's important work in order for us to make good, informed decisions. And we're very grateful for the individuals that do that at the local level. For the 2022 data, we had about 448 churches. I say about because there's new churches starting, there's churches closing, and so that 448 is an approximation for that date of 12/31/2022. At the end of February, we had 77% of our churches submit their data prior to that deadline. After that, another 13% submitted their information after the deadline, usually with the encouragement of conference staff. And then the final 10% either submitted very little data or partial data or no data, which means I had to estimate their information probably based on prior years. This is certainly frustrating as we want to make informed decisions, and the more participation we get from the local churches, the better information is overall. Finally, there were more than 900 warnings in the data, which is pretty typical. A warning is generated anytime there's a significant change from the previous year. And we ask churches then to put an explanation for why there's been such a big change. So that's just part of the data process that we go through annually. All right, let's look at the actual data. On the screen now is our membership trends from the past 8 or 9 years. In 2022, we followed a similar trend from other years in our membership. We continued to decrease as of 12/31/2022. Our membership is at 47,243 members in the state of Wisconsin. As many of you are probably wondering, with upcoming disaffiliations, what will 2023 look like? So I took those disaffiliating churches and estimated that at the end of 2023, we will be somewhere around 42,000 members. This is certainly sad. It's something for us to think about. It's something for us to mourn the loss, to grieve that loss, but it's also important for us not to dwell on these numbers. We do have work in the conference to do. We have work in our local churches, and we have work in our community. This is something for us to be aware of. And again, it's something for us to mourn, but it's not something for us to dwell on. This next slide talks about weekly participation in our worship services. As a year-to-year comparison, we see average weekly worship has increased slightly. Online worship continues to decrease as we get farther from the pandemic shutdown, which is when we had a maximum of online worship. It's also important to note our average weekly Sunday school participation increased pretty drastically from 2021 to 2022. Next is our Christian formation group participation. Overall, there's an increase there, but a pretty significant decrease in our youth participation in Christian formation groups. And I wonder if how much of that is tied also to our Sunday school drop on the previous screen. For local church participation, for the most part, we see increases year to year. I want to point out that United Women in Faith, their projects hit $250,000 in 2022. It's good to see that these numbers are increasing. However, I should point out that they are still not at the level that they were prior to the pandemic. So it's good that we have growth, but definitely not at a level that we've seen recently. This next slide is shows the assets and the debts currently held by local churches. And again, this only includes what local churches have and what local churches share with us. This does not include assets or debt held by the conference as a whole. And similar to other years, we see our physical assets, the value of our physical assets grows by a little. And it also shows that our debts going down pretty much for the most part. Again, all at the local church level. This next slide showing salaries and housing combined. And overall, it shows that we are paying our staff at our local church level more than previous years. However, this can also be sort of tricky to analyze because this doesn't necessarily mean that each individual is getting paid more, but it could be a change of the number of churches that are reporting or how different staff might be classified, whether it's the lead pastor or the associate pastor. So overall, it looks good, but it might need to be more examined more closely on a local church level. This next slide looks at the income from our churches, and it shows that those first two categories, the first two largest categories, dropped slightly from 2021 to 2022. However, overall, total budgeted income did increase 1%. So you can see even though those first two categories, pledges and non-pledges, but known members, they both decreased slightly. Those decreases were made up for in fundraising and that other category. That other category contains things such as rent or return on investments. None of the numbers on this page include non-budgeted items such as memorials, capital campaigns, and grants. All right. That concludes the portion of the report where we compared the 2022 data to the 2021 data. Next, I want to give some current characteristics of the Wisconsin Annual Conference. Let's see. First off, this is the distribution of our churches and our memberships based on district. Orange and yellow are the two southern districts, and the shades of green represent the three northern districts in Wisconsin. And you can see on the pie chart on the left, a little bit more than half of our churches are located in the three northern districts. But you can see over on the right, a little bit more than half of our membership is in the two southern districts, which all that makes sense just based on population density in our state. This next slide shows the distribution of our churches based on membership of that church. This histogram is read by, on the y-axis, we can see the number of churches that have that number of members in that bin. So you can see that second bar shows that more than 100 of our churches have between 25 and 50 members. Okay, so you can see a large portion of our churches are on the left here, and showing that they're smaller churches with fewer than 100 members. The average church size is 105 members. However, this data is heavily skewed to the right. I did cut off a couple of churches that are in 800 members or 900 members. They really pull that average up to 105, but a better way to read our data would be to look at the median, which is the exact halfway point in the data. And our median church size is 63.5 members, which indicates that half of the churches in Wisconsin are lower than 63.5 members. All right. So that median really shows a good midpoint and really indicates, gives us an idea of how small most of the churches are in Wisconsin. This next histogram shows the distribution of how much we pay our lead pastors. And to get these numbers, I added up the lead pastor's salary plus their housing. And again, this is a histogram. So the way we read this is the y-axis counts the number of churches that are in that specific category. So that largest bar represents that we're just under 80 churches pay their lead pastor between $12,000 and $18,000. You can see there's a decrease, but then there's sort of like a little bump there between $42,000 and $48,000, and somewhere in there is the minimum for full-time pastors. So you can sort of see why that bump is occurring right there. This next slide takes a little bit more explanation. It's sort of a extension of that previous slide. I took the amount that we pay lead pastors, their salary plus their housing, and I started grouping them based on that total. And the first cut point I did was $44,000. And I consider that any church that's paying their lead pastor $44,000 or more, I classified them as someone that can afford a full-time pastor. And I know that number is not exact, but it's close enough, and it's a good cut point in our data. And then any church that was paying $22,000 or more, I classified them as a half-time pastor or more. Any church that was $11,000, a quarter time, and so on. And again, I'm classifying these as based on the number of churches, not the number of pastors. So that means that two churches that both can afford a half-time pastor might be hiring the same person, who then is fully employed, but employed by two churches that can only afford a half-time pastor. So again, we're counting the number of churches over on this graph on the left. The orange section is those churches that can afford a full-time pastor. So that pie chart on the left indicates that about 30% of our churches can afford a full-time pastor. The 30.4% plus the 21.0%, those would be the churches that can afford a full-time pastor, a half-time pastor or more. So about half of our churches can afford a half-time or more. Or the flip side of that is about half of our churches cannot afford even a half-time pastor. On the right, this is where our membership is located. So it looks like, and still the colors are assigned to the same categories. So about 2/3 of our members attend churches that can afford a full-time pastor. So again, on the left, 1/3 of our churches can afford a full-time pastor. On the right, 2/3 of our churches, 2/3 of our members attend churches that can afford full-time pastors, which does make sense naturally. Larger churches can afford more time, and larger churches have more members at them. All of these past slides, I'm not necessarily presenting this for any specific changes, but again, I just think we should be aware of the characteristics of our conference as we're making decisions, especially conference-wide decisions. All right, this slide, to sort of finish up, I know my presentation is not the most uplifting of presentations, so I wanted to end with a challenge for us. I've pulled these three categories. These are items that I think that we all as individuals can influence. And I also think that these are three items that I think could have a direct or an indirect effect on some of the other things we measure, such as membership. 79% of our churches in 2022 reported that they had some sort of Christian formation group. 70% reported that they did some sort of small group, either an ongoing or a short-term small group, and 65% reported that they did some sort of community outreach ministry. Now, if we are in a school situation, you'd have a C+, a C-, and a D based on those percentages. I would like to set a goal for us as a conference to do better in 2023. I would like us to get A's, right? So I'd like you to consider, we're right now halfway through 2023, and I'd like you to consider whether your church has done these three things or plans to do any of these three things in the upcoming year. And if not, how could you? If you're thinking that your church is too small, I'd like you to consider who else in your circuit you could work with so that you'd have more people to work with. I'd like you to think about who else you can work with across the conference. We've now learned that with technology, we're not necessarily limited by distance. We know that we're a conference of small churches, but we also know that we are 42,000 members strong, right? And there's 3,000 members across this conference who are hopefully working towards increasing these numbers. I do believe that if we work towards these, improving these types of numbers, other numbers in our conference will improve as well. In conclusion, I have 3 tasks for you to do, and I just realized I did not update that one because you're already watching the full report, so you've got that one checked off. The second thing I'd like you to do is to send questions to my email address. If you have questions or comments or ideas, please send them my way. I like talking about stats, and I like talking about the Methodist Church, so definitely send them my way. And then finally, I am asking you to engage in Christian formation, small groups, and ministry outreach so that we can improve our 2023 statistics. Thank you very much. Good day.